So in this video, we're going to talk about how to tie code to your user forms that you create, because obviously we need some VBA code to be able to actually open this form or to close the form or to add the employee that we just created to our table in Excel. So we definitely need to put some VBA into this form. Before we do that, I'll talk through this form really quickly. We had built a couple examples in previous videos just of what all of these different controls are. So this form is built specifically for our employee table that we have here. So when I go back to my form I have here, I have first name, last name, start date, role, and I put a little checkbox for full-time, and I'm going to assume if this box is not checked that the employee is going to be a part-time employee. I put all of this on a frame, and this is just to help organize the form a little bit. I also changed the background color of our regular form, and this is something that I typically do just to help things kind of look a little bit nicer and make it clear what the user is supposed to interact with. It's totally up to you if you want to change the background color of things, or if you want to put your objects on a frame, or if you just want to put them on your regular form. It's not going to change anything at all in the code. So just talking through each of these so you can go ahead and build a similar form. The first and last name are both just regular text box, which is this control here. And I just entered these. I made them a little bit longer than the normal text box so that we'd have some room to type in. I also made the start date a text box, and I left this one a little bit shorter since it shouldn't, take a whole lot of room to give a start date. The role is a combo box, and this is because we will be actually building our drop-down list of our roles, and we'll do that in the VBA code. And of course, the full-time down here is a checkbox, which is this object here. And combo box is this one. It's different than list box, so make sure that you use combo box. Otherwise, you'll have to use a little bit different code. You'll have to change out combo box for list box later on. And then of course we have our two buttons, add and close. And so I need to go through all of these and name them. And again, like we mentioned before, we want to avoid naming things with spaces or anything like that. So I'll call this close button. I'll click on my add button and I'll call this add button. And you can see on both of these, I changed the background color property, which is this property here. I also changed the font to be bold, and I increased the font size to 10 just to make it stand out a little bit. I'll go up to my checkbox here and we'll say full-time check. We'll go to our last name box. We'll call this last name text. Call this one first name text. Come over here to our start date and we'll call this start date text. And lastly, we have our role combo. Now you can see I'm putting this little tag at the end for combo or text box or button or whatever this happens to be, the control happens to be. The reason that I'm doing that is it'll make it a little bit easier when we're in VBA to remember, oh yeah, this is a text box, this is how I should interact with a text box. And so it'll help us later on if we build that into our names a little bit, it'll make it easier for us to reference in VBA appropriately. So I'll go ahead and I'll give you a minute to pause the video and you can go ahead and build this form. And that should have been enough time to pause. So now we can step into the actual code that gets tied to this user form. If I go over under Forms on the left in our little Project Explorer window here, and I right-click on this form, you can see two options come up, View Code and View Object. So if I go ahead and save my database really quickly or save my file, and then I close out of this form, we can see when I right-click on this, I have two options, View Code or View Object. If I click on View Object, my form pops back up. If I right-click and select View Code, a regular code window will pop up. And this is just like the module window that we've been working with in all of our other videos. But this time we can see this is actually tied directly to our add employee form, which is this form here. So any code that we put into this acts essentially as a module for this specific form. So this is where we'll want to do things like clear the form when we open it up, or build our list that should appear in the role box, or tell it what happens when I click add and what happens when I click close. And so that's what we'll be doing in this video. So we're going to start by building the close buttons code. So if I click on my close button here, we can see we called it close button. So over in my module window, I'm going to create a private sub, and we're going to say close button underscore click, open parentheses, close parentheses, enter. So now we can see up here this automatically changes to be the object of our close button and the action, which is click. And so this matches what we've told the code we want to do here, which is our object before the underscore, and then after the underscore, the action that we take. So this means when we click on our close button, this sub is going to run. So what we want to do here is close the form, which we're going to do by saying unload me. And what this means is that in our code here, we're telling it we want to unload an object, which means make it disappear. We don't want to see it anymore. Get it off the screen. So unload this object. And we've told it the object we're interested in unloading is me, which means the object that this close button here lives on, which is this add employee form. And we could have done this a little bit differently, but this works just fine because we know this is always going to be the object that gets closed when we click on the close button. So we'll say unload me to close this form. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a second private sub. And in this case, we're going to look at our add button and what happens when we click on that add button. And so what we want this to do is if we go back to our main Excel file here, we want the add button to create a new row in this table and fill it all out. So right off the bat, we can see we're looking at the 6th column is when our table starts. And if I click into this table and go to table design, I can see that I've named this table the employees table. So when I try to reference this table, I'm going to call it employees. So now I'm going to go back to my code, make sure we're clicked into our add button code here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to create some variables. So we're going to start with our first name variable, which we'll just say is first, and that's going to be a string, which means text. Our last name variable will also be text. Our start date variable will also be text. Our role will also be text. And last but not least, we have our full-time checkbox. And because this is a checkbox, it means our value is going to be Boolean, which means it's either checked or it's not checked. There's no gray area in between. It's either true, which means checked, or false, which means it's unchecked. And so we're going to go ahead and create that full-time variable as Boolean. And what this means is later on when we go to store this value in our table, we're going to want to do a little bit of a conversion because we don't want to store that Boolean value in our table. So when we initially pull this value, it's going to pull as either true or false. And we don't want to put the word true or false into our table necessarily. So we'll do a little conversion that says if this full-time variable is true, then I want to store the value full-time in my table. And if this value is false, then I want to store the value part-time in my table. So we'll get to that when we actually add a row to our table. The next thing we want to do is actually pull all these values off of our form. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to set our first variable, which means our first name variable, equal to the first name text box value. And this first name text, if you'll remember, is what we named our first name text box here. I can see this is called first name text, so that's how I reference it in my code. We'll keep moving. So our last name variable is going to equal our last name text box value. Our start date variable is going to equal our start date text value. Our role is going to equal our role, and this one is a combo box if you'll remember, value. And our full-time is going to equal our full-time checkbox value. So now we've gone ahead and we've pulled each of these values off of the form based on what we named these particular objects that we're interacting with. So now we can go back to our actual Excel file and add a row to our table. So the first thing we need to know is what is the sheet name, and it looks like this is called sheet 1. Second thing we'll need to know is what column our table starts in, which is column 6. And the third thing is what is our table name, which we determined earlier is employees. So now I'll go back into my code and I'll go ahead and activate my sheet 1 worksheet. So I say worksheets, sheet 1, which is the name of my worksheet, .activate. So now I know everything that's following this is going to assume that I have my sheet 1 activated. I'm going to go ahead and create a little variable r, and I'm going to store in this variable the number of rows that are currently in our table. So we'll say on our worksheet, sheet 1, which we don't really need to do since we just activated this, but just to be safe, we'll go ahead and type that out. And then we'll say list objects, employees. So now we've referenced our employees table that is on sheet 1. Then we want to look at the list rows, which means all of the rows that are in this table, and we want you to count them. So this variable r will tell us how many rows are currently in our table, and that does not count the header row or any of the rows that are before our table. So if I go back to my Excel file, r should return the value 1, which means we only have one row of data in this table right now. It's not going to count this header row, and it's not going to tell me this blank row exists. So I know in my code later on, I'm probably going to have to account for these two rows here, the header row and the blank row. I'll go ahead and go back to my code. Now we want to go ahead and we're going to want to add a new row to our table. So we'll say on sheet 1, we want to look at the employees object, which is our table. We want you to look at the rows in that table, and we want you to add a row. So I'll do that like so. And we could have put this before our R, which probably would have made this a little bit easier for us, but we'll just keep working with how we have it now. So we know now we're going to have a new row that's created just below. So we'll be looking for this particular line of our table. So now I know if I'm trying to reference this cell, and I don't want to use it by specifying, I'm looking at my table. If I just want to use the cells function of my worksheet, I know I'm going to be looking in column 6. And then I know I'm going to want to add 2 to cover this, and I'm going to want to add 1 to cover my new row, and I'm going to do that to my R value. So I know my R value is going to count the number of rows in my table, which is currently 1 row. Then I'm going to add 1 for this blank, add 1 for this header row, and add 1 again to get to the row that we actually want to interact with. And this will work no matter how many rows we have in our table. So let's say we have 3 rows in our table. Again, I'm going to want to add 1 for the blank, 1 for the header, and 1 just to get to my last row that I've just added. So this will make sense when we step through the code in a minute. So what we're going to look at is specifically cells R plus 3 row. And again, that's 1 for the blank, 1 for the header, and 1 to get to our new row. So we've added 3. And we're going to look in column 6, which is column X, or F, which is what we've just determined is our first column of our table. And we want the value to be our first name. And then we're just going to step through on the same row, step through each column, and store our variables that we just pulled off of our form. So again, R plus 3, this time column 8. The value of this cell should be our start date. Next we have our role, which will be in column 9. And now we've gotten to our last variable, which is this full-time variable. So if I go back to my sheet here, this is where we were explaining earlier, we don't want to store the value true. We don't want this cell to read true or false. We want it to read either full-time or part-time. So I'm going to do this using an if statement, which we've covered in a previous video. So we'll say if our full-time variable equals true, then for this cell, which is R plus 3 row, 10th column, I want that value to say full-time. So if my full-time box is checked, if it's true, then I want this cell to read full-time. Otherwise, or else, I want this cell to read part-time. And then we'll end that as well. And maybe we want to put a little message box at the bottom here that says the employee has been added to the table. And we'll go ahead and jump past this buttons input. We'll just let the OK button be what shows up, and we'll title this success. So we're going to jump back over to our Excel file. And we can see in this file we have an add employee button here that we haven't really done anything with yet. And if you don't remember how to add this button, there's an Excel controls video that shows you how to do this, or in the developer tab, you can click on insert and go ahead and insert a regular form control button. In our case, we'll just leave it as add employee, and we'll right click on this and say assign macro. And we can see right now, I actually don't have any macros that have been created in our workbook. Remember that all of the code we've written is tied directly to our form, and it's all private, so we can't reference any of it. So what we're going to do is cancel out of this window, go back to our VBA, and we're going to go ahead and insert a module. Now we can see this is just defaulted to module 1. You can rename this if you want to, but it doesn't really matter. We're going to create a public sub, and we'll call this open form. Open, close parentheses, hit enter. And this time in this code, we want to show our add employee form. And remember, we've called this form add employee. That's the actual name of the form. So we're going to reference that form directly by typing its name, and then we're going to type dot show. So now when this line runs, VBA is going to find this object, which is our add employee form, and it's going to show that object, which just means open up this form and show it to the user. So now I'm going to save this, go back to my Excel file, and in here, if I right click on this again and say assign macro, we now see we have this open form macro that showed up. So I'm going to highlight that and I'm going to click OK. Now one more thing we're going to do in our code before we move on, we'll shrink this down a little bit and we'll go back into our add button code. And I'm going to click just to the left of this first line here. And what this does is this will actually pause our code on this line and bring us into this code window so that we can step line by line through this code and see how it actually interacts with our Excel file. Now I'll go back here. I'm going to click off of this button in a different cell, come back in, and now I'm going to click on the Add Employee button, which we would expect will open our form. And it looks like that's exactly what it's done. So now I'll just type some dummy values into here. So we'll just say first name, last, we'll say 1120, something like that. Right now we can see we don't have anything built into our role combo box, so I'm just going to type a custom value and we'll cover how to create these lists in a different video. And we'll go ahead and say this is a full-time employee. Now if I click close right now, just to test things out, we see it does close my form automatically. I don't get any sort of message or anything like that. Now you can build in messages, you can build in actions to happen when you click on that close button. But for our purposes, we just wanted it to close out of that form. So now I'll click Add Employee again, and it'll pop our form back up. So I'll say first, last, start date, I'll use 120 again. We'll just create a custom role. Just as an example, we'll check the full-time box. Now when I click Add, it's going to go ahead and open up our VBA window, and we can see it's paused on our first name line here, which is what we expect. And we can walk through this step by step to see how this will actually interact with our Excel file. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink this window over a little bit. I'll move this form code over, shrink this down a little, and we'll do the same to this file. Now you'll notice right now if we click in here, it's not actually going to let us interact with our Excel file. You should get a little sound that makes it clear you're not allowed to click in here. And that's because the property of this particular form right now is set to true for show modal, which means while this form is open, I can't actually interact with my Excel file. So instead, we'll just go ahead and shrink this down a little bit more. And now we can see all of our Excel files, so we should still be able to see how this code works. So I'm going to step through this using F8 on my keyboard. You could also go up to debug and say step into, but I'll just use F8. So now I've stepped past this line. I can see my first name has pulled the first from this cell. Last has become last from this cell. Start has become our start date we entered. Role became the role we entered. And full-time is reading as true, which is what we expect because it's a checkbox and we told it this was going to be a Boolean value, which means either true or false. Now I'm going to go back to my Excel file and activate my sheet 1, which it already is, but this is just a precaution, so we'll hit F8. It's now going to pull the number of rows currently in my table, which we would expect would be 1, so we'll hit F8 again and check out this value, and it does say 1, so we know that this is read correctly. We'll press F8 again. We should see a row be added to our table here, and it looks like it has been. So now we can go ahead and start filling out these values. So starting in column F, which is column 6, we should see the first name, and then 7 should see the last name, start date, role, and now we're back to our full-time value. So this is where we built our if statement to say, hey, if this value equals true, we want you to store the value full-time. If it's false, which means the checkbox is unchecked, we want it to read part-time. So if we press F8, we should see this statement check out, so the condition is met, and it should enter the cells equals full-time line. And it does, so that's good. So I'll hit F8 again, and we'll see it does read full-time now. Hit F8 again, one more time. Should get your message box that'll pop up and say the employee has been added to the table. We'll click OK. And now we're on end sub, so we'll press F8 one more time to go ahead and exit out of the code. So now if I come back into here, I can close out of this form, and we know everything that we've built has worked properly. And next we'll be talking about how to actually assign lists to that combo box.